Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are, and welcome back to another episode. Well, good morning, David. Thank you for being with us on The Ways We Move, the podcast that highlights innovative mobility solutions and the people behind it. David, tell us a little bit about yourself. Who is David?
Well, thank you, Nicholas. I'm David Gamble. I am a aerospace engineer by training, but over the last 30 years, I've been working as a mechanical structural engineer. Recently, become a chief engineer of a couple of different eVTOL companies, a regional hybrid engineering firm that. I had just worked for as the head of design and integration, and I worked 20 plus years with Boeing. My background is for a personal perspective is I grew up in Texas. Fort Worth is my hometown. Moved
Wow.
to Pennsylvania in the 90s, and I've actually lived here longer than I'd lived in Texas. So I consider myself a Pennsylvania. Worked on helicopters, worked on fixed wing aircraft, Chinooks in general, V-22s. So I've kind of been that genre of leading edge of technology and really started to get keen into the next generation of propulsion systems for eVTOLs, multiple rotor, but have a lot of experience in materials and just last probably 10 years have kind of gotten to be more entrepreneurial perspective mindset and kind of being more aware of me being a global engineer rather than just a corporate engineer. So that's kind of my background. I could go into more details, but I think that's kind of a general gist of my kind of history.
Yeah, and that's the thing that really surprised me the most when I finally got to get to know you better is you have such an extensive background. Not only you're one of the rare people in the well, I shouldn't say rare people. That's not very true, but you're one of the prized people in advanced air mobility who actually has a background in not only aviation, but you have a really solid background into what we call conventional aviation OEMs like Boeing, and also, you have a background with helicopters, and you mentioned the V-22, which is a tilt rotor, tilt motor platform that we've all come to know very well as the Osprey. Boy, that has been an interesting ramp up to get that aircraft finally going today the way it is. And you also have that background now with a few AAM startups. We're not going to mention who they are. People can always figure it out by going to your LinkedIn, obviously. But you have all of that experience. And on top of it, you're an engineer. But there's one thing that our conversation led me to understand is you also have a good understanding of what leadership is. And that's something that we've had wonderful conversations about over the last few months. And that's something I wanted to talk about a little bit about it because so let's start from I think a very important, crucial, pivotal point in aviation industry in the 90s. Boeing, and this is the infamous merger of Boeing and McDonnell. And we know what happened. We know everything, but it sounds like you were there and you actually had a pretty close seat as to what was happening. Tell us about how did it feel like? What did it look like back then when that merger was happening?
Well, okay, let me put the background on that. So I got into Boeing working on the 777 down in Wichita, Kansas, working on the 777 thrust reversers. I came up to
Mm,
Philadelphia to work on a fixed leading edges. So I really got to understand the organization under Mullally, or not Mullally, yeah, Mullally and Phil Condit. And those were two were kind of like syncopado. Mullally was more of the engineer. Phil was more of the marketing guy, right? Even though they're both engineers, you kind of get that feeling. And then later in life, I kind of realized that's the good way of like
yeah,
creating an organization is that you
absolutely.
can never have one person doing both the operations and the finance because a lot of times one trumps the other when it comes to personality. So one personality is more focused on operations, which is the engineering and making sure everything's done right. The other guy is more the investor, marketing, make sure the communication outside the company is kind of doing that. So I really got an understanding of that, and I really like that compatibility, and also the working together theme that Mullally and them had really cohese the culture to produce and have a culture of quality, safety, and just basically doing the right thing for the right reasons. That was basically what generated and created the 777. And so I saw that, and that rolled into, Phil Condit went to be on CEO. Mullally became the president of commercial, and that's the end of the 90s. Then all of a sudden, the merger happened, and it was kind of odd. And this asynchronization that was like the opposite side of what I believe it was Harry Stonecipher kind of created, and it created kind of this imbalance. And first thoughts were, oh, okay, Boeing would be, or the Boeing commercial would take over for Seattle, and then the military side of Boeing would be under St. Louis and the McDonnell Douglas portion of that. That's what kind of we thought was going to happen. But soon after, um, we I'll use this like a case bed as far as Philadelphia site for Boeing. We had commercial and business because we knew the business of doing business with military. It was always cyclic. You always had military go
Right.
up and then commercial go down. That way you
Yeah.
could keep a steady level employees, and so you wouldn't be laying people off. Well, the mindset, because of what I just mentioned before, was, well, Philly, you couldn't do commercial. So we had to, and I was in the middle of that because I was on the commercial side of Philly and was possibly going to transition over to military at one point or another. But with that, it basically undercut us. So we had to diversify, undiversify ourselves from the commercial side of it and just get rid of it from the site. And that was an indication of how things are being ripped apart, being minute, that and this culture of core synergies were starting to come about, right? So Philly was helicopters, military helicopters, not commercial.
Right.
We diversified ourselves. We actually had, you mentioned the V-22. We actually had the 609 at that point. We were doing
That's
the
right.
airframe work, and I knew the designers doing it. So that was ripped underneath them, right? And then we sold it off to Bell. Then Bell sold it to Aerostructures. So Aerostructures down in Tennessee, a lot of the guys went down to Aerostructures. And you just start seeing this rip apart of projects. And so it really disturbed the culture, right? Or it didn't really improve it. It actually undermined it. So that, I could go into more on that, but that's kind of the start of it. And so this dichotomy of upending the business model really took a toll, and it has taken 20, and we're into the third decade of it, and it's really taken a toll on the company.
Yeah, I think you mentioned a lot of great points in there, and that's, first of all, I mean, the whole point of us talking right now is really to try to understand what can AAM learn about traditional conventional aviation companies, and that's like Boeing is a great case example of it. If you think about it, the 777 was the last full Boeing product that Boeing made, and to this day, sevens don't really have any problems, right? I mean, they're pretty solid. Anything that happens after that, we're starting to see some cracks in the design. And you're right. Stone Cipher was, and I'm going to paraphrase what he said, but his proudest moment that he talks about is that he changed the culture at Boeing from being an engineering company to a profit company. And this is also the introduction of the GE alumni, the McDonnell alumni that somehow get to the top levels at Boeing after not the most successful periods for both McDonald's and GE. So that was always a little bit of a head scratcher. How did they get up there when Boeing was doing so well? And then the really the worst part of it all, and the underlining part of it all, is that I don't know what led them to think that they could change a fairly well integrated company like Boeing to start acting like Airbus, that was designed from the get go to be spread out all over the world, to have wings from there, cockpit from here, and then assemble everything more or less in Toulouse and Hamburg. And I think that was the crucial mistake. And I think it is that part of that, Jack Welch era of we got to revolutionize everything. We got to reinvent the wheel. And you're right, we're up to the third decade of the results
Well,
of
I
that,
think,
and boy, they're not
yeah,
great.
I think it's a two-pronged problem. One is a community, right? So we got mixed signals from management saying, well, and this is kind of the Jack Welch approach. We always go down to the bottom dollar, which is cost and the process, right? It's kind of like optimizing the process. Well, it was almost like on steroids to the point where it did not take into account communities. It did not take into account, the because a company and corporation is people, right? So if you don't treat them right, or you don't, I always hear the word stewardship, right? If
Yeah.
you don't if
Yes.
you don't take them into account and kind of like somehow or another you negate them, you go down a path where they're just another number. And that kind of dehumanizes the company to the point where they become more of a pawn than the actual part of the team or the corporation. The other side of that, we're going through a time where we were diversifying, and this started in the 90s because I was at uh, General Dynamics on the F-16, and we produced
That's right.
everything, right? So we could see raw material coming in to a factory and see if,
Wow.
a
Wow.
F-16 fighter jet fly
Wow.
overhead and be delivered. We did the chemical treatments, we did the bending of the metal, we did, to this rough extent, machining, or a local machine house would do it for us. There was this, synergy of, well, we don't do that anymore. It goes to the core business. So we diversify ourselves. I mean, we started that in Philly as well, where machine shops, right? We didn't want to do the machining anymore. And it got to the point before I left, they've even, they call it blue streak, like repairs and stuff that need to be done on the
Yeah.
shop floor. We even outsourced that, and to the point detriment that we couldn't respond in time to get
Yes.
a product out the door. And so we started they took it to the extreme where you couldn't control your suppliers. You're at the mercy of their it was basically the financial perspective of it. Oh, if we just offload it, it's cheaper. And that was that whole, I guess you could call it strategy, business strategy that just was, basically garnered that if a sales guy could offload the whole thing to them, he would, because the product, the marketing structure, and the gauges that they were measured on was how could they, undercut, or how could they save 10%. And that was all the incentive they needed to basically drive us. I mean, look at what Boeing just did. They just bought back Wichita, Kansas
Spirit.
from Spirit, where they sold it 15 years ago, and then they bought it, at a markup price, so almost 100%. And so to realize that they just went too far, and I think it's those two things that it's kind of like, okay, guys, what is your vision for the 20 years? In 20 years, and how does that really help the communities you're in? And I think the global companies also had a hand in that, right? We wanted to sell aircraft everywhere, so we did a
That's
lot of
true.
offsets. And so, I guess global corporations, I didn't, you don't necessarily need to have all the labor being done in the U.S. And that's kind of the start of, in the 90s were the start of, ripping manufacturing out of the U.S. There's a whole like
Yes.
triad of things going on all at the same time
Yes.
that led to not only Boeing, but just general atmosphere of manufacturers just basically leaving US. And I think, that has a hand in it as well. Uh,
Yeah, and I think you're right. We started a trend in the '90s that went all the way up to 2010 and beyond. One of the things I've always wondered, if Mulally would have been the CEO, truly had the reign of the company, what a different company it would be today. Because I met him, he is sharp as a tack. He knows what he's doing. He did a great job, by the way, for Home Depot. I met him at Ford. Did a great job for Ford. I mean, he was he was the right person to bring those two companies together into something successful. And to your point, this divesting of your core competencies, we witnessed that also in 2008 with GM. This is when we had the big financial meltdown. GM, Ford, and Chrysler are basically, they have nothing to show for, right? Ford was doing a little bit better. It had just renegotiated its loans, didn't really need anything from the government just yet. But GM and Chrysler did need that. And GM, you know what they did? They went straight out to China. They went to Shenzhen. They went to one of the worst performing car manufacturer of the time, SAIC, and taught them how to design, build, conceptualize, and everything to the point where, so they signed a 30-year contract, which is, by the way, running out next year or in 2 years. And to the point where now SAIC designs, builds, implements everything, the terrain, the Equinox, makes it, builds it or assembles it in Mexico, and GM just slaps on the logo, which, of course, in this era of the Trump administration, where tariffs are really high, especially against Mexico, it's more than a one monkey
It's
wrench
a
in there.
whiplash. It's a basic
It's a
whiplash,
complete whiplash.
and then
And
the
we know
businesses don't know how to respond.
and the business don't know how to respond. In fact, GM, I hear now, is actively pursuing people to work on autonomous vehicles because the whole cruise thing didn't go really well. Fine, learn your lessons, move on. But I think GM finally understands that. We'll have to see what Chrysler does. And this is actually a pretty good segue because with this experience that you had there at Boeing, and by the way, I didn't know that the V22 was offloaded to Bell, because I remember Bell having a sort of a prototype like that in the 60s. So I always thought it came from Bell, but it's interesting that it went back to Bell, who had that
So you mean the
experience with these.
609, right? You're
Yeah, the
talking, yeah,
609, right?
609. Yeah.
Yeah. So it was interesting that it went all the way back out there and everything. So with this background that you had, and then somehow now you're going into, well, at the time we didn't call it advanced air mobility, but you go into this new electric air mobility, out of lack of better word. That's the name of my company. Tell us about that switch. Why did you make that switch?
Well, well, twofold. I didn't see any growth potential. I mean, I did start work for AWPC or Leonardo up in Northeast Philly
Right.
on the 609,
On the
by the way.
609?
And I really wanted to see that go, but I wasn't, not to go into any details on the way it was being, kind of operating, and the way, and I was promised something and something else happened, but I won't go into that. But it was more of a challenge for myself as an engineer to grow into, hey, there's something better out here. And I'd heard inclinations on Uber Air, Uber Lyft, and how that kind of transitioned to, Joby kind of bought into that. But Joby had been around for a while. And then also too, when I was at Leonardo, I met up with a guy that had done a vertical. It was called Zero Project under Leonardo.
Yeah.
His name
Hmm.
escapes me right now, and he's actually in Singapore. And so he built that in like 8 months, I think like half a year. And it was two props, uh, tilting, one on a wing. I don't think it had a tail. I'm trying to remember the shape of it. It's usually like a Project Zero for Leonardo. The whole project would come up, and so that got me interested in the propulsion, the electrification of the propulsion. And then a marketing guy that I knew at Leonardo that had had a ton of history on V22, XV15, that whole lineage
Yeah.
to 609. He moved over to a company called XTI, and
Yes,
so
that's
I
right.
moved. Yeah, so I contacted him. He got me hooked up with Bob Labelle, who was the CEO at
Bob.
the time at
Excellent
XTI.
guy. What an
Excellent
excellent
guy.
person.
I
Oh,
love to work with him. He was looking for a chief engineer. And so I thought, that maybe this is time in my career to kind of I wouldn't say take risk, and basically grow myself as a person to kind of experience what's the generation. Because I've always wanted projects that are kind of on the leading edge of technology, and I felt like this was going to go somewhere, and have at least some type of footing of the Uber of the skies type of approach. So that's kind of how I got into that. Go ahead.
Were you at NB 2019?
No, I don't think so.
Okay, because that's when I met the whole team of XTI and Bob, and I just thought, wow, Bob is such an amazing person. And I have a really, really, really funny story about that event. You guys had a little scale model of the
Yeah,
aircraft, right?
right.
Believe me, some people would come up to us and say, "Wow, this is really cool, but how are you going to fit people in there?" The model, and we joked and said, "Well, you'll just slide down."
Well, no,
I'm
actually,
sorry.
I think
I
I
had to
joined.
say that because the things you hear sometimes, people don't always hear that. But this is a model that indeed you could have shoehorned one person in there, but it was really funny to hear that. Anyway, sorry. So please go on. XTI has a really great project which really evolved a lot this past decade. Anyway, so you were the CTO of the company.
Yeah, well, yeah. At the point, what the person I was talking about on Zero Project was the CTO of the project. So I was the chief
Gotcha.
engineer, but I
Okay,
worked
gotcha.
closely with him. That's kind of my first workings with somebody who is, kind of on a technology sort of thrusted apart. I mean, but I joined XTI probably a year later from what you're talking about, 2019. I joined them
Okay.
in 2000 during the pandemic. And so,
2020.
right. So late 2020, kind of get an understanding of that. The actual chief engineer that they had just passed away a few months prior that was working out of Seattle. So I was basically taking over what he had done. They had a flying prototype that they'd done which was stored in Utah at one of the Lockheed Martin hangars. I forget what the exact location, but just understanding that the history of that, because I did not know that XTI had been around since 2013, and
Absolutely.
it had started off as a turbofan, a twin
That's right.
turbofan with
Yep.
transmissions and stuff. Reminded me of the X-22, so I really dug into the X-22 lineage from the 50s actually. That
Really?
and the X-22 was the longest flying X plane or X project in record. It had
Really?
they had 2 prototypes. They were both flying in the '80s, which I didn't know, out of
Oh, I didn't
Bell.
know that either.
Bell had a flight center in Buffalo, and I think they changed it. I forget what their name is today, but they actually still have the one of them in a museum. One crashed, and I don't know if there was anything left of it. So I
Wow.
almost got an opportunity to go sit. We were on a vacation up there, but didn't get the chance to do that. But the lineage of that, a lot of this, a lot of this can go back to the 50s. All these designs,
Yep.
it's just the
Yep.
technology, it's just
Yep.
the materials, advancements in manufacturing really started to come to light. And that's what was really intriguing for me to kind of enter that realm, is to try to piece all that together to make it viable. And I hate to drop into marketing, but a lot of futuristic and tech that, you think about in the 50s, it could be reality now. But then you still look at technologies that are not progressing as fast enough. So 5 years later, it's kind of like technology is not moving the way that the industry wanted it to. And I think there's coming realizations, and yeah, I could go through all of that. But on the reverse side of that, from a organization perspective, it really got me to think that, marketing investors really dovetail into what engineering and capabilities are. And you really started to see the kind of the breakage of what you can actually do. Mentioned about the XTI model. It wasn't necessary to me, wasn't necessarily how many people I can get in there. It was basically how much payload I can get in, because
Yes.
I know
Absolutely.
the complications when it comes to vertical flight. And if it hadn't been for the turbofan, a very lightweight,
Yes.
weight ratio, helicopters were never taken off. And that was like a 50s,
No.
60s
Yep.
innovation that really provided them the power to weight ratio to be able to utilize a And so that was always an indication of that and how that, kind of fed into the mindset of what the industry was going for and how that kind of conflicted based on what was going on.
Yeah, and that's
And just
something that
being realistic. I think there's this clash between, being over optimistic and being realistic
yep,
and knowing when to pivot. I think there was talk about organization governance and just understanding that, and investors, making sure that you're meeting the goal of producing a product in a short time frame, not 10 to 15 year
yes,
project. Because
yeah,
everybody, investors are looking for a return ROI. So if you can't get a product, because at the end of the day, and this is something I realized when I kind of entered into this, I can always redesign something, or I can always improve something, but the return on the dollar is always, mindset that you need to be mindful of, because at the end of the day, you got to produce a product that's going to be generating revenue.
that's right.
And
Yeah,
and a lot of these folks, and I don't necessarily say this as being pessimistic, but it's kind of like, there needs to be a wake up call, because it's you got to be able to produce something that's going to be useful to community, to the industry, and to the general public. And if it's not, then how do you go ahead?
Financial feasibility. I mean, that's the core of any business. And before we get into that, because there's so much to be said about investors having the right type of investors for these kind of companies, and everything that we've been through. The XTI solution, and this is something that I'm always amazed at people like you who are, your background is more in conventional aerospace, and then all of a sudden you're seeing the intrigue or the interest or the potential around, electric propulsion, distributed propulsion systems. XTI was actually one of the early ones who said, no, we're not going to go fully electric. We're going to go hybrid. In other words, the two main, I guess, duct rotors or inside the wing rotors were going to be electric, but still they were going to be connected at one point or another. But the one behind was definitely driven by a turbo shaft or something like that. I remember. So they really
Right.
struck that
Right.
hybrid very well. And I always thought the engineering was like the perfect transition. The hybrid before the electric vehicle kind of transition. Then you said something really interesting, and it's true that our industry, AAM, it's sort of split between, and I don't want to vulgarize it like that, but it's true. It's split between a sort of Silicon Valley mentality and also an aerospace mentality. Whereas in one sense, Silicon Valley is bringing in a lot of new blood, new fresh ideas, and everything. But sometimes it gets a little over optimistic, and it also starts to attract investors who are not industry savvy, who are used to ROIs much sooner than they traditionally are with conventional aerospace. And on the other side of the spectrum, you have those AAM companies, startups that are really steeply versed into coming from aerospace. And these guys are almost under promising, which is normal in aviation. That's what we normally do. A decade, $1 billion, 1,000 engineers. That's how things work. But then you have that fresh wave of, we're going to be certified this year. We're going to be flying this. We're going to be flying that. And that creates, and that, by the way, that creates a lot of confusion in the public. I still have people who come up to me and say, hey, so yeah, I'm excited. We're going to be flying next year. Well, not necessarily. Airworthiness certificates and commercial certificates are very different, billions of dollars difference, right? So this is where I'd like to get your point of view, because you saw that first
Well,
up front.
that's the difference between, software and hardware, right? Software guys can throw something out. Man, I mean, who's to say that the product is day one usable, right? It may be 98% or 80% usable, but then they'll say, oh, well, we can just do an update, right? Because they can just push out, because they got so efficient with pushing new software out on a
And that's
regular basis.
Microsoft really like pioneered that perfectly
Pioneered
well.
that.
The Windows was never really great. Office was never really. We used to wait for SP2 before we actually ran it at one point or another, right? I mean, that's something we all
Yeah,
laugh about.
I remember
In
the
the
days.
Linux world, in the Linux world, I'm on a rolling distribution. It updates every day, and I never have to go back or wait for anything like that. So yes, that's a
I
very
mean,
good point.
I really have dug into system engineering, and just uh, you know, it's kind of, there was always a taboo on, well, this goes back to leadership, that, failure is not a death knell. Failure is something, if you respond to it well enough and you fix
Yes.
it or you understand what's going to. But when it comes to software, it's much more nimble. But when it comes to hardware, building something, there's so many different approaches to it that a software guy, I've talked to them guys, they just don't understand. Aviation is safety. Aviation is, it's falling from the sky. So it can fall on a house. It doesn't have to be somebody inside the vehicle. It's people on the ground
Yeah.
that you're concerned with.
As we
Quality and safety is a concern
as we just
that
saw
they just
with
don't
that
understand.
horrible yeah, that fateful UPS flight, 3 pilots inside the airplane, but 7 on the ground, right?
Yeah,
So
exactly.
it's a 3D problem, really, or actually a
Yeah,
4D
it's a
problem.
3D problem, and then you start to run up against thinking that certification, a certification of vehicle. If you look at all these certifications of aircraft over the last 30 years, I guess maybe the only couple that have done it is like Honda for the Honda jet. And then
Yes,
all of Boeing's are all derivatives. Even the
that's true.
777, in some extent, was a derivative of the 67. But
Yep, the
I think
6-7.
it was fully, I think eventually they just did a full up, but it took them 10 years to do that. And we were constantly trying within Boeing to reduce that to like 3 years or 5 years. They never got to that point. I mean, go
No.
to 787, it's 10 years
Oh, the
because of the
787?
regimented. Yep,
It was more
787.
than that. It was late by a few many years, right? The
Surrender, it was,
787.
well, it was 2001, the ideas were coming up, but it really didn't kick off until 2003. They wanted it to do in 2008
Uh,
because they were trying to meet the 888 for the Chinese,
that's
and
right.
that just went and passed. And I think it was 2011, I think. So it was close
Yeah,
to,
alright. Took a
if
good
you go back
decade.
to the origins, it was a little bit over 10 years.
Yeah,
Um, but
which is normal. It's
that's normal, right? That's
Yeah, that's
normal
very
from
normal.
fixed wing, production. All
Big
your suppliers are known. You can update the engines. Most of the engines are just upgrading, right?
That's right,
I
yes. Yeah, that's true.
Most of
There are
the engines
3
are
engines, and they're
GE.
being upgraded all the time, absolutely.
Right, just a little bit more power, a little bit more compressor speed. Just parameterizing that pressure chamber from the
Yes.
blades, the intra blades to the secondary blades, just to change those pressure pressure differences.
And I remember seeing, this was, late '90s, we lived in New York City, there was an event, I forgot which it was the Louis Vuitton Concours d'Elegance, right? So a lot of old cars and everything, but there was one thing that they were showing, the turbofan of the 777, which didn't exist yet. David, it was I've been flying since the '70s on 707s, DC-8, 747s, right? To see how big that bypass was, it was absolutely phenomenal, and they truly had one person standing on it and barely could touch the top of that.
Right.
That thing was beyond impressive. I had never seen anything that big for a turbofan. It was
Well,
incredible.
that's there. It was bringing in so much air and compressing it. That's basically what it did. But the
Yep.
main, compression chamber is the same. I mean, it has
Yep.
that has not changed. It was just basically the pressure difference. It was increasing the pressure difference so they
Wow.
can generate more thrust out the end.
More
And
thrust, more
you can,
bypass.
and I think they're getting to the point where they can't compress it anymore,
So
because they can't increase the diameter because it just doesn't make sense.
And that's an interesting segue and a parallel that we have with the, internal combustion engines with automotive, right? I mean, there's so far you can carry an internal combustion engine opposing piston design, right? And rotary is a different story, right? And Mazda's done a really great job. I think Mazda's pushed it to really include the friction loss all the way up to the wheel and all that kind of stuff. So they've done a really good job. But there is a plateau, right? And the steam engine eventually met that same fate, right? Which eventually introduced the electric motor as being much more flexible, better power to weight ratio and density. Not as good as the steam engine, still nonetheless, but much more flexible and everything. Now we're seeing this in the air too. Hence, those external rotors, I forget what they're called, those new engines that they're working on for aviation with the rotors outside.
Line rudder rim, because I've actually was just thinking about one of those the other day.
Yeah, yeah, and that was, by the way, something that Embraer looked into in the 90s. Technology wasn't ready. Now a lot of companies are looking into that, and that, could be a way to eke out a little bit more than that, but we're at that point now. We're at that point where there is a paradigm shift. We really need to move into something else. And then one thing that I wanted to segue into is going a little bit back towards leadership. And this is the idea that now we have this new, not new technology. I mean, certainly EMFs are nothing new, magnets are not new, right? But we have this electric motor that we've known for a very long time that now is opening up a whole new can of worms, I guess, of sorts, right? Now we can go and fly with that battery energy density and power density is getting good enough to fly at least 10 to 15 to a half hour. So now we're getting into that part of the world. One thing that I've noticed, and this is at the structural level of startups, is yeah, you left your internal combustion engine world to now embrace electric mobility. But the one thing that I keep on seeing, and a lot of startups do that, and this goes right back to what you were saying about marketing. There's such they're embracing almost like the old ways of doing business into this new way, new technology. And it's like I don't see that going really well because if you're going to do a startup, which by definition means a whole new way of doing business, especially with a new technology, you need to embrace a new way of doing business. You can't bring in the old ways and expect good results, right?
Right,
So this is
right.
something that we started to talk about, and I wanted to get your point of view because you did work with other advanced air mobility startups, and it's hard to find that one that has all the right ingredients. Does it even exist?
Well, you bring up a good point. That goes back to me as far as leading edge technology, and it's not necessarily the aircraft; it's actually the processes. And so it's hard to get that combination. And understand that, um, you know, a lot of times, folks, like I mentioned before, it's not necessarily marketing; it's the operation of the vehicle. And so if you understand that, it's the requirements, it's delving into the requirements because requirements drive how a design is built. And I think with the advent of AI, that's going to be
Mhm.
I mean, I think that's kind of is going to be a new, I think for the processes is going to be a game changer if a lot of these startups start to embrace that. But there is a lot of, issues
Oh,
with
yes.
IP, uh, who owns it if you're using a cloud-based, ChatGPT or something like that. But there's a lot of I back in the old days when I was at Boeing, we had a whole, like, team of people doing certification, requirements,
Yes.
processes, in addition to just trying to design the aircraft. But the problem with that is that you almost did that tandem and you had a lot of overlap, right? So you kind of like you did a design and then you had to go back and make sure it was meeting the requirements. And so you had this lag, lead lag type of issue between the design and requirements. So if a customer or somebody had specific requirements, there's a lot of perturbations going through or disruptions going through the design. Oh, we can't do that, or we need this access that isn't existing on the design, or
Mm,
they want, I mean, case in point, a lot of icing, or they're going to be
yes.
operating at higher altitudes. So a lot of times these startups try to do everything for everybody and wind up with something that wasn't good for anybody.
Mm,
And it was hard to do that on a small team because
of course.
one requirement would conflict with another, and it was hard to communicate that to individuals without putting a lot of time into it.
That's such
So
an interesting point you're
working with
making there.
teams that, yeah, I mean, I can make assumptions, but a lot of those assumptions would be wouldn't be backed up with anything. And I think AI
Yeah.
could help out with that.
Yeah, it's interesting what you're saying. You bring a really good point. Is that you're right? Traditionally, the engineers would design something because the company would, say we need to go in that direction. Then work with FAA to find out if it was certifiable. Then somehow ODA came in there, which was a whole new can of worms there. But there was that back and forth and everything. And it sounds like today in AAM, startups are working much closer with the FAA, and the FAA is also working much closer with the industry to find out. I feel like, in one sense, there is a better cohesion between the two. Same thing with EASA, by the way, and even ICAO. So the three of them are very involved in the process, much more so probably than they were before, as both are writing the book going forward. But you're right. Now the problem is, we're looking at a company that's 1% of what these bigger companies can do. In other words, you have 1,000 engineers with Boeing and Airbus. Well, you've got maybe 130 if you're lucky with these smaller companies. So that's a lot of things to do, and hence the bottleneck. And that's why you
Well,
need.
that goes back to culture, right? That goes back to leading to culture. If you don't have the experience, if you don't have the mindset of dealing with the new tools, the
Mhm.
new, I guess, shortcutting a lot of the, I mean, it's almost like you need to reinvent job descriptions because it's if you rely on, I mean, the IPTs, integrated product teams, or functionals, or business operations and stuff, that's the old mindset. And it's like, okay, how do I fit? I mean, I'm even thinking about this now. How do I use an AI agent, right?
Yeah,
So it's kind of like if I was to take it down, it's kind of like taking an existing aviation company, breaking it down as components. A lot of those components could be done by an AI and
absolutely.
just being oversaw by a more experienced individual.
Exactly.
Right? And so if you bring in inexperienced folks into a new startup, you might as well with
Start
no
from scratch.
understanding on existing processes.
Yeah, yeah.
I don't know how you get there from here,
That's
because
that's a great point because we will have someone who, a close friend of mine I've known for many, many decades, who is actually an AI expert. And I know when you say AI experts, a lot of, eyebrows are raised, but he actually does have a lot of experience with that, the last decade or so. And we've had those talks a lot, how far can AI help us? And it turns out that it can help us pretty far. The biggest problem that we have is, how do we use AI? Who is going to be able to really work with AI to give the right definition, the right tools, the right prompts to get the right kind of results? So AI is great. And even with us on the infrastructure side of things of AAM, and one of those things that we're thinking about is AI is going to be really great with all the raw data that we're going to get, whether it's travel information, energy usage and storage, UTM, ATM, you name it, but it's not gonna be the decision maker by any stretch of the
no,
imagination.
no,
It's
no.
just gonna bring out all the information, give us a sort of, this is what's happening, and then have a bunch of humans saying, "All right, well, this, yes, that, no." But
Right.
yeah, again, you need to find the right people who
Well,
understand AI.
yeah, and the other biggest thing, for a startup, and I actually attended a Dassault Systems
Mm,
forum this early this year in Houston, and a lot of the topics was on AI, but it was all directed to current revenue generating manufacturers. I mean, they had one there that was doing massive, almost agricultural equipment or construction equipment that could do one-offs at a moment's notice, and also simplify their warehouses, because each product built their own parts, right? And then they would always like say, well, this other part over here on this other product, can't you use that one, and kind of simplify the storage? Well, if they brought in AI that could kind of like make all this database useful, so that a part on one product could be reutilized on another part, as just an example. And then it harked to me, the outcome of that forum was they were they were going after existing forums, not addressing how startups were to
yeah,
operate or how they could harness this, because they don't have any data to start with.
absolutely.
All the materials and stuff, because a large part of certification is process and process of materials, and how materials are verified that they have the material properties, especially composites. And if you don't have a public, I mean, there is public materials, but not the advanced materials that sometimes you have to rely on. You have to get all that certified, right? It's not the vehicle, it's the systems and the
It's the
subsystems.
systems. Yeah.
And so all
Yep.
that. And startups don't have that. They don't have that to rely on. They have to, they almost have to buy into it. And that's a very big business proposition.
It's a big bet. That explains why Joby is working with Toyota, and a lot of these other companies are working with more
Yeah, well,
established companies.
Toyota's manufacturing, but they're
Oh,
not
yeah, it's a very
aviation, right? There's
yeah,
no
that's and
Toyota
that's the
doesn't do
problem.
anything flying.
Yeah, and by the way, this is what XTI was saying, and we were saying the same thing. It's like, well, yeah, automotive have the throughput, the capacity, and everything, but their tolerances are not the same at all. So
No,
I get
no.
it, I understand, but in reality, you're going to have to redesign all these tools completely, 100%. The streamlining, we all know, the operations, you have that down pat. That's great and everything. One thing that I have to say is I've enjoyed our conversation so much that I lapsed on the time, because usually by now we've already talked about your personal motivation. So I just want to say you're always invited to come back, because we can talk about a lot of different things. But I want to get into that part. Considering everything that you've been through, on the conventional OEM side of things in aviation, the startups and everything. What is your motivation? Why are you still in this field today? What gets you out of bed in the morning?
I want to do something. I want to do something better for myself and do better for others. I mean, it's always that challenge of optimizing the process. I mean, just as I mentioned, and waking up and still trying to figure out how to do AI agents or what is. I mean, I've gotten to the point of I get to the point where I want to be a teacher, but it's kind of like, what am I going to teach if AI is going to threaten? So that's what gets me up in the morning is the legacy of what is the next generation? What are they left with? And
Yeah,
making sure that they know what is the next job's going to look like. I mean, I'm hearing folks that coming out of college, what is their career supposed to look like? I can't use myself as an example
yep,
because
no,
that doesn't it won't happen this time. I mean, it's going to be different,
our
and to
generation,
pass that on of what
yeah,
is that? That's
yeah,
what
our
gets me up in the morning.
Yeah, our generation definitely has. We can't relate to what these guys are going through right now. We already went through some big changes, but their changes are way bigger than that. I mean, I went through just like you, the PC introduction, right? That was going to remove all of our jobs and have computers do the job. Then we went into the interactive, because I was also a teacher and a trainer, the interactive medium, right? And that was going to
Yeah.
remove all the teachers in the classroom. Well, lo and behold, we adapted, we use it and everything. And now we have AI, and that's the same thing. Now we're learning how to use AI with the right prompts, making sure that it doesn't hallucinate too much. So
Yeah,
it
but
is a
you gotta know
problem.
when it's hallucinating, right? That's
And
the
when do
problem.
you know? And when do you know, right? So I've gotten to the point where every single anything I do with an AI, whether it's ChatGPT, Claude, Gemini, whatever, list your sources very clearly. Where did you go? What are your sources for that? So anyway,
Yes.
we could talk forever about that. But David, I wanted to say thank you for being with us today. Again, it's an open invitation to come back whenever you want. Maybe just one quick word. What would you like listeners and watchers to walk away from with today?
I think it's, be always mindful and aware of where you wanna go, and if you don't have a plan, create a plan, and if you need help creating a plan, either myself or anybody else that has 30-year plus experience, seek them out as
Yeah,
mentors
yeah,
because I really doubt that going through college, there's some doubts about, what is your plans after college or, or, what is really being certified, right? So
right.
accreditation, what does accreditation really mean for your life and your career? Seek out a mentor.
Yeah,
That's what I
seek out
want
a mentor.
everybody to take away from.
Yeah, that's very well said. I think more than anything, and I'm starting to see a lot of that. But these graduates that have amazing diplomas, have gone to school, have learned methodology. Now they need to actually understand, how did we get here, and where do we go forward from that? And we're writing the book
Where
on all of that.
and I guess that's like the biggest thing is where do they get the experiences? And I need to we need to develop that pathway of gaining that experience because there's no
Exactly.
projects on the horizon that I see that I experience with 777,
No, no,
that
no,
can really, engage. They talk about, AI, but AI is like you're gonna utilize it, not but you need to utilize it for something,
for
right? It
something.
it it in itself is only a tool. So what do you
Yeah.
utilize it for?
Yeah, and we're at the dawn of the technology, and right now, I think there's the concentration is on how do we use it more so than how do we evolve the technology. So, David, thank you so much for being with us today. I really look forward to our next conversation because I want to do look into that experience with the 777, which did it the right way. You know, it was an expansion of a 677, sorry, a 767, and something that Boeing chose not to do with the 737 Max. You know, in other words, they should have recertified that airplane as a brand new airplane. So those are the things I want to talk about next time about what AAM can learn from all of this. And you are the perfect guest for the ways we move. Thank you again for being with us, David, and I will
Thanks.
see you very soon again.
Same here. Thank you.